Hello, I'm Glen from Speak Life. We like to see all things through the lens of Jesus. And who am I with?
You're with Nate Morgan Locke, Glen.
Nice to see you.
I'm here, and we have a guest.
We have a guest all the way from Prague, Ted Turnau. Can you introduce yourselves to us?
Sure. Introduce myself.
Sorry. What did I say? Self. Yeah, all of them.
Yes.
All six of them.
All of me?
Yeah.
You are Legion.
My name's Ted. I am not suffering from multiple personality disorder. I am currently chair of journalism and media studies at Anglo-American University, but I'll be switching in September to literature and culture. So we're playing musical chairs at my university. And I am heavily invested in helping Christians engage culture. I want to be a resource to them. And so I've written some books and do my thing in Prague, Czech Republic, where I teach classes in religious studies and cultural studies and media studies and social theory, all the cool classes. That's me.
All the cool classes from Ted. Okay.
Yep.
And you've just come out with two books, which is a little bit greedy, but one of them is Oasis of Imagination, which is a longer work. And then we've got the punchier, briefer version, I guess.
Well, it is punchier because it's got a fist on the front cover.
It does.
That's right.
A fist with a paintbrush.
Paintbrush.
Yeah. And this is called Imagination Manifesto. And the first question I want to ask, Ted, is usually when you publish a manifesto, it's because things are broken, you're on the brink of a revolution, everything's falling apart. Is that your vision of the church or the world at the moment?
My vision of the church in the Western world is that we are in a pretty solidly post-Christian culture where once upon a time most people considered themselves Christian, whatever that meant, of varying degrees, but we have since moved on. And because of that, the church finds itself in an increasingly marginalized position, culturally, in terms of demographics, in terms of numbers. And it seems to me that there are many Christians freaking out about this. And not handling it particularly well. In America, this comes out in terms of Christian nationalism and trying to enforce a cultural conformity that those who that most of the country feels very uncomfortable with. In Britain, to the extent you can generalize about it, it seems like there are a lot of people kind of drawing back into safe spaces and trying to live a sheltered, quiet existence where they don't have to deal with the craziness outside their own bubble. And neither of these, I think, is really helpful or healthy for the church, and it's certainly not helpful or healthy for the culture around us. So the manifesto tries to find a third way besides shouting and trying to beat people into conformity or running for the hills and, Katie bar the door, circle the wagons sort of thing. And this time through imagination and engaging in the cultural conversation in a way that is positive and productive and interesting and beautiful and subversive. All that sort of stuff. And I think that's something that the church really hasn't cottoned onto yet. So I'm trying to cotton them.
Yeah, okay. So not culture war, not Christian bubble, but
right.
Oases of imagination. Mm-hmm. What is an oasis, Ted?
An oasis, as I use it in the book, is a gigantic metaphor, a recurring metaphor for Christian works that aren't aimed particularly at Christians, but are rather aimed at engaging both Christian and non-Christian imaginations into a place. The thing about oases is they're not bubbles, they're breathable. right? You walk into an oasis, and there you find shade and refreshment and all sorts of interesting plants and stuff. And it's there that I want people to, I want people to be creating works that sort of shake them up a little bit, as well as delight them at the same time. So, and I wrote this story, this parable about, trying to figure out something that's at the bottom of the pool, but I'm not going to spoil, no spoilers. At my house, we have two mottos, one for the family, which is the Turnau motto is salvation is by grace alone, but dessert you got to earn. And the second is no spoilers ever. So anyway, if you want to check out the introduction, I have tedturnau.com just went live like a few days ago. So you can read a sample there. I hope that's okay with IVP.
Teasers are okay, aren't they? Teasers, not spoilers, is what we're saying.
Yeah. Teaser trailer. So I want the church to start becoming invested in supporting those people who can do this sort of work well. And there's not a ton of them around because of the quirks of the market or the demands of the market. You make money as a Christian artist by giving Christian audiences what they want, which is, if you're a musician, you give them rock and roll, sort of like the world does, but safe for the youth group. And that, I think, is a disastrous sort of, it just kind of stifles creativity. You make movies that are just either propaganda or pablum. You make television shows that are nice and soothing, but anodyne. I mean, I think we can be doing so much better. And there are people out there doing so much better, which is why in the big book, I spend 4 or 5 chapters talking about, here are some people who are doing great things.
I'd love to hear more about that. Yeah. So who should we be aiming to be like, or who is sort of blazing a trail in this area?
Ooh, well, I mentioned Kieślowski. Nate and I talked about our mutual love of Kieślowski, which is really interesting because Kieślowski didn't call himself a Christian. And I think this is one of those rare instances where non-Christians can actually capture a Christian imaginative vision better than a lot of Christian filmmakers can. I talk about Tolkien, of course. I talk about my co-author in Imagination, in Imagination Manifesto, Ruth Naomi Floyd, who is a fabulous jazz vocalist as well as an art photographer. And I talk about the rapper Sho Baraka, who I don't know if he's made that much of a splash in the UK. One chapter I didn't get to write, I had written, but the licensing fee for the lyrics was too much. But David Eugene Edwards of Woven Hand, I consider to be a real. There are just so many ways to do it well. Blind Willie Johnson, the old blues guitarist from the 1930s. Who else did I talk about?
And what are they actually doing? Like, you say they do it well. What is it that they do?
So a big chunk of both books is describing what makes a Christian imagination distinctive and what makes for a kind of Christian imagination that can resonate well with non-Christian imaginations, that can build oases well. And there are 2 things that have to happen, in my opinion. One is you have to maintain a tension, what I call brightness control, a tension between the darkness and the light. That is, a Christian imagination understands the brokenness of the world, what I call a cross-shaped imagination, and it understands the hope that can't be conquered by the darkness. And it holds on to both of those at the same time. It doesn't say, yeah, the world is full of unicorns and bunny rabbits and rainbows. And it doesn't, like there's nothing bad, and it doesn't kind of sink into despair either. And it's all, death and gloom and darkness. But it says both at the same time. And I think that can be a really, if you can do both of those at the same time, that's really, really arresting. And that can be done in any number of ways. And then the other thing is, I think we have to maintain a balance between hitting people over the head with our message, shouting sort of propaganda, Jesus is per minute in your song and things like that. Or what I call shouting or mumbling, which is you are so very, very subtle in your Christian witness that you basically sever yourself from your Christian roots, and you just kind of end up sounding exactly like what the world has to offer. Whether that's like, oh, but I have a real great social conscience. But I think there has to be something there that's distinctively Christian. And maintaining that balance is really tricky. And Christians are going to have all sorts of disagreements about how one does that best, but I think it needs to be done. It needs to be a point of discussion. Because right now what we're doing is mostly blatantly out there Christian praise songs. Praisey, praisey, praisey. And there's a place for praise songs within the sanctuary of the church, but that's not what gets past them, right? So my when I was university, we used to talk about subliminal, and then there were things that were just bliminal. And Christian
Isn't that a
art
swear
tends
word?
to be very bliminal. So, yeah. So, and when you can do that, when you can do both of those well, then you get an effect wherein you can kind of plant a time bomb and watch it go off, the way Jesus does when he tells the parable of the workers in the vineyard. And you have the whole crowd saying, those guys ought to die. And Jesus is like, yeah, you know who I'm talking about? I'm talking about you. And they're like, oh, wait, what just happened? Or Mark 7, where Jesus just kind of, the Pharisees are talking to Jesus' disciples and saying, you shouldn't be eating with unwashed hands. And Jesus says, now you guys don't know where uncleanness comes from. It doesn't come from outside. It comes from the inside. And then he just walks away and everybody's going, what? But it made some people curious, and they dug deeper and they learned. They started catching a vision of what Jesus was talking about. And Jesus was doing stuff like that all the time. And I think the best storytellers, the best songwriters, the best game devs. Oh, that's what I forgot. I'm sorry. I'm on a little bit of caffeine right now. What the one that I forgot to mention was That Dragon Cancer, which I know Glenn knows because you interviewed them as I interviewed them.
Yeah, Ryan and Amy Green.
That's exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
Because if you know anything about That Dragon Cancer, it got all sorts of accolades within the indie dev community. They went to, they talked about all sorts of things. And they were not particularly evasive about their own faith, but the way they presented it was as far as you could get from bludgeoning somebody else with the gospel, or with, you need to be like this or God won't love you, or whatever. It was just kind of asking people to come step into their shoes. And it just broke people. Like PewDiePie broke down sobbing when he streamed this game. PewDiePie. For those of you who don't know YouTube, PewDiePie's like the most famous idiot on there. And he's not known for his sensitivity. But It's just, and I think once we do that, then they can begin seeing the gospel as beautiful.
So just think about who's doing it well, and the challenge. I mean, like, the book that I probably recommend to more people, which has a living author, is probably a book, Popologetics, in terms of, you want to engage with pop culture, you want to help young people particularly think through what they are watching and what they're consuming from a Christian perspective. So we've clearly got that. But it's pop culture, it's popular, it's reaching a mass audience. Obviously, this book, or this pair in terms of Oasis of Imagination and Imagination Manifesto, are much more about Christian creatives making their own cultural artifacts and pieces of media. Do you think there is a way for Christians to become popular within these, so without selling out? To what extent are we just so mindful of markets that people play it safe and then stay within, contemporary Christian music or evangelical filmmaking or whatever?
Yeah, no, that's a great
Mm-hmm.
question, and there's a couple of things to say about that. First, the contents of these two books were originally supposed to be in Popologetics. Like, it was part 2 of Popologetics. Here's how you deal with popular culture that's not Christian. Here's how Christians ought to be making their own popular culture. But there was an editor when I was shopping the book around who said, look, nobody's going to take a first-time editor and allow you to publish a 550-page book. That's not going to happen. And besides which, you actually have 2 books here. So why don't you just treat it as 2 books? I was like, oh man, he's right. And 10, 12, it turns out that doing a book on imagination is slow work. But so that's the first thing. The second thing is, I actually deal with this question in the bigger book, Oasis of Imagination. There's a guy who goes to our Czech church, who's another American like me, who used to front a band called Dismas. His name's Zach Zegan, which is a rock and roll sounding name if ever there was one. And
Zach isn't a name, it's a sound effect. Did you know that?
That's right. for like the old Batman cartoon, the old Batman show, like Zach.
This is my brother Kapow.
Yeah. And I interviewed him and asked him about his experience with the recording industry, and he told me he was very, very he wasn't critical of his label, but it was obvious to me that there were these subtle and sometimes not so subtle pressures on his band, which, for lack of a better name, was kind of Christian screamo, to be kind of more radio friendly, something that more Christians would find comforting and encouraging, and yada yada yada. And so I think the market pressures are there and are hard to escape, which means we either need to find alternative ways of funding Christian culture, and I talk about this as trying to get behind what Makoto Fujimura, the Christian artist, calls the gift economy, borrowing from Lewis Hyde. And we need to educate audiences to want something less nice and conformist. Like what I want Christian culture to do is to go up to somebody, or at least some pieces of Christian culture, is to go up to somebody and just grab them by the lapels and give them a good shake, right? Just so that they're going, oh, and then, well, what was that? And it can't be horrific, but something that grabs them and resonates with their imagination, so that they feel like they've been hit by something that's amazing. Like something that gives awe rather than awe,
Yep. I wonder what the YouTube subtitles will do with that. But yeah.
But raising audience awareness of the vast emotional spectrum that's available to artists for exploration, and the vast aesthetic landscapes available to artists, as well as finding ways to fund artists and to support artists that don't make them slaves to the marketplace. The people who do this stuff best are the people who kind of hone their craft and take it on the road, and they build up a core audience who's really enthusiastic. Like David Eugene Edwards is a really good example of this. He is virtually unknown in the United States, unless you're like a hipster living in New York. He is huge in Europe, and he's huge among like all these heavy metal guys because he's putting out something that is serious and that's aggressive. I mean, he's got this really odd position, which means he will never be asked to record anything on a Christian label. And I say, hallelujah, please don't. The more Christians we can get working and being independent voices in mainstream media, the better. But it's really hard. There's a filmmaker I interviewed in the Big Book who just voiced his frustration about whenever he tries to go to, these Christian business people who are making tons of money, and they're like, okay, what's the ROI? What's the return on investment? Like they never see it as a mission, as funding missions, because that's what these guys are, is they're ambassadors to their own culture. They're Christ ambassadors within a dry and hostile land where they need to plant oases. But that's not how Christian people who have the means tend to think. They tend to think about, well, what do I get out of it? And that's not how, honestly, that's not how the gay, the LGBTQ plus people think about it. They invested heavily, and we're seeing the dividends.
And
right?
I wanted to ask you about that, because you do go into that and say that attitudes towards gay marriage, for example, or generally LGBTQ plus whatever else issues have changed so rapidly. And the thing that changed them was actually incredibly zealous activism of people working within media to create a plausibility structure that was incredibly persuasive for huge portions of the population in the West.
Yeah, and investing in young talent, screenwriting talent, and cinematographic talent. The same filmmaker told me about they had these awards for gay film, best gay film, and he said in the early years they were just all terrible, but they kept supporting them and they kept recognizing those people who did it well, and little by little, they're now a powerhouse in Hollywood.
So put that together
across the world.
Yeah, put that together with your chapter sort of against the culture wars. So we don't want to be culture warriors, but you can recognize where there have been interest groups that have wanted to shift the needle in the culture. They have done it through the imagination. And so I can see why you would absolutely want to subvert the warfare language, because we do not wage war carnally, as 2 Corinthians chapter 10 kind of says, but we do wage war. And
sure.
and that is a great chapter in the Bible, isn't it? On the imagination. We cast down imaginations, says the King James Bible in 2 Corinthians 10 verse 5. And so Paul has a warfare kind of analogy together with the imagination. And I wonder whether, are you saying that imagination is the opposite of warfare? Because I guess I'd put to you that perhaps what you're talking about is a warfare. It's just you're subverting the kind of warfare that the rest of the world is going on about, and that's how you're wanting to cast down imaginations.
Yeah, I would say 1 Corinthians 10. It is 1 Corinthians, right?
2 Corinthians, second Corinthians.
2 Corinthians 10.
Yeah.
2 Corinthians 10. It's important to understand the context is church discipline. So I think the warfare that Paul's talking about is these super apostles coming in and trying to persuade people, oh, we got a better, you don't have to listen to Paul, blah, blah, blah. And he's like, no, we talk with power. So there is, and gosh, wouldn't you know, the church has a lot of conflict within it, tends to do, and some of which Paul says is good so that's so that God can show who's got favor and who doesn't. But he doesn't say, I mean, there are other places like wild beasts in Ephesus and things like that where it is a struggle and Paul bears the marks on his body of that struggle. So I would say that there's going to be an inevitable conflict of imaginations, of orientations of imagination, right? There has to be. We have a different first love. We have different loyalties. Sociologist James Davison Hunter really points this out really well, that in some ways, we're not even speaking the same language. What family means, what freedom means, what healthy means, what natural means. All of these are up for grabs right now. And becoming less up for grabs as a very aggressive new majority says, no, we're tired of the old ways of thinking. So there's going to be something like that. There's going to be conflict, but it's got to be a conflict of principles and not a conflict of people, right? It's got to be, it's not us forcing people into what we say. And it's got to be, when we find ourselves in conflict, we also have to love the people we're conflicting with. And I think culture warriors don't do that well. I think a lot of people are lashing out in fear and feeling threatened and saying, oh, we've got to hold the line against the libs and all of this sort of lingo. And they absolutely don't love the people they're opposing, and the people they're opposing know that and say, wait, you're supposed to be following Jesus, but I don't think you are. And it's bringing the name Christian more and more into disrepute. So there's got to be a different way that we conflict. When I talk about cultural subversion, that's a sort of a warfare sort of term. When I talk about, Jesus planting bombs, he's not actually planting bombs that are going to hurt people, but he is. They're more moments of revelation where people go, whoa, wait a minute. And that's a far more difficult thing to pull off, right? To get somebody to reconsider their own position, to get somebody to reconsider their own assumptions about life, that's a gargantuan task. And that's what artists do, or some artists do very, very well. It's not something that the Christian community typically rewards artists for doing, however. They prefer to have artists speak soothing tones to them and tell them everything's going to be all right and you are going to win the culture war. Something like God's Not Dead is basically Christians patting themselves on the back saying, yes, we're in the right, and this movie shows us that we are, which is not the message that the world needs right now, I think.
I suppose
I don't know.
One thing I'm again struck by with the, what did the LGBT plus community do to change opinions, to persuade people. And, you can look at a series of milestones within popular culture where, this was the first, LGBT representation in this area, or this was the first kind of, we're literally just waiting for the first LGBT Disney princess. It's sort of, it feels as though you're just waiting for those kind of thresholds to be broken. And the challenge that I think you put in many ways quite rightly to, let's say, evangelical filmmaking, God's Not Dead and its sequels, being a prime example, is that it continually presents the Christian as hero. The Christian's the hero of the story, and by being the hero of the story, this is a Christian story, and you ought to be more Christian. If there has been in popular culture a real change of opinion on issues of human sexuality by presenting LGBT, through LGBTQ plus representation, is it not the case that we could achieve a change in the cultural landscape by presenting a Christian hero or a Christian as hero within, let's say, film, for example? When was the last time you saw a film in which the hero was a Christian that wasn't one of these, poorly made, embarrassing to watch, cringeworthy, evangelical films?
Well, Joss Whedon gave Captain America a kind of a throwaway line,
Yeah. There's only one God. Yeah.
There's only one God. And that was a beginning, but I wouldn't call that Christian representation. I think that the thing about heroes is they have to be sympathetic, and just kind of inserting a Christian in there, it would have to be. There are non-Christian films that have presented Christians sympathetically. Like there was a little indie film 12 years ago called Winter Passing. And one of the main characters was a Christian, played by Will Ferrell, of all people. So it does happen, but it's really kind of rare. Because Christians have been using up any goodwill towards them by being very loud and aggressive, at least in the United States. It may be very, very different in Britain. But the other thing is the thing about God is Not Dead, Christians weren't just the heroes, they were also the victims. There's a huge sense among evangelicals that we're being victimized, and therefore we need to fight back. I think there was a legit victim in Jesus, and he didn't fight back, and he said, "Father, forgive them; they don't know what they're doing." And he was concerned about the people who are killing him. That's not the vibe that's coming from Christians today. So if there was a Christian hero, if you have a Christian writing a Christian hero, that would be really, really difficult. I think that somebody who's a really good writer could pull it off. If you pull it off well enough and could pitch it well enough, you might even get a studio to greenlight it, or you might get backers. But what it cannot be, is something within the Christian film industry. Did you read that footnote? There was a footnote I had about this guy who worked for a Christian film studio and wrote this film in which there's a gossipy Christian or somebody who's just super critical, legalistic. And they did the film, and the feedback they got, they made a new rule. No longer can you have a Christian character who has any serious character flaws. No more, because that hurts the bottom line.
Do you think that's, though, because the film executives, the studio executives there are evangelical Christians who actually aren't especially creative? They're just responsible for the money, and so they're thinking it plays better with our audience?
Yeah. Well, I think studio execs tend to be businessmen. They don't tend to be artists. That's the first thing. The second thing is that Christians are really good at protecting the home team. And so you don't tend to get Christian films that do a deep dive on any of the really serious problems that are afflicting the church. Racism, sexual abuse, abuses of the patriarchal culture. Kudos for Mike Cosper for doing that stuff on Mars Hill. And he got so much flack for doing that. There's nothing that I can think of written by a Christian that does the same thing for Christians. There's nothing that would spur a Christian to repentance. I think that's and the world watching knows that. Are there secular filmmakers that expose secular problems that promote discussion? Yeah. There's lots of them, but we don't seem to be able to do that. We don't have the capacity for that yet, because I think we're just feeling so threatened, and don't want to be seen as weak before a watching world.
Where would you put like Mayor of Easttown? So Kate Winslet was in that drama series set in New England, and it's very Catholic, and interestingly they kind of. There's good priest and bad priest, and so they kind of embrace both the abusive side of, the scandals in that part of the world, as well as...
Was it New England?
Where was it?
I feel like it was actually...
Pittsburgh?
It was Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania, yeah.
Because they had
was
Wawa.
That's right.
Wawa.
I read about it.
Yeah, Pennsylvania. There you go.
But I as a Pennsylvanian, that's where I was raised. That's my stomping ground.
He's got a hoagie just off screen.
It's so Catholic. Like the final scene is the bodily assumption of Mary into the attic for those who have seen it. But
I haven't seen it, so I have to plead ignorance. But what you're saying to me sounds really encouraging, and means I need to put this on my watch list. And do you know who wrote it?
Brad Inglesby, is that his name?
Do we know anything about where he's coming from?
I think he is Catholic.
Okay.
I mean,
but this is another thing, Glenn. Catholics have done this well. Evangelical Protestants haven't.
Yep.
That's and so with the exception of maybe. I'm blanking on the name now.
C.S. Lewis?
No. Although yes, but I'm
interestingly,
thinking
for the book
filmmakers.
you picked Tolkien, so that's interesting.
Yeah.
That your example is Tolkien.
First Reformed. Who's the writer there? He's even a Reformed guy, or was. Anyway. I mean, that seems to tread into that territory, but really weird. I don't know if you guys have seen First Reformed. It's a disturbing film in which there's a lot of soul searching, but in the process of soul searching, the soul searching pastor kind of loses touch with reality a little bit.
I think one of the more discouraging examples is Ted Lasso, isn't it? When you think Ted Lasso in real life, I mean, he at least grew up evangelical. Right. He's pretty much Ned Flanders kind of transposed, and yet the absolute black hole at the heart, spiritually speaking, at the heart of that. When they have the funeral, there is absolutely no spiritual content. There's nothing and they end up singing "Never Gonna Give You Up, Never Gonna Let You Down, Never Gonna Run Around and Desert You," right? And we all kind of chuckle along, and I'm just sitting there thinking, there is a howling wasteland at the spiritual heart of Ted Lasso, when in real life Ted Lasso goes to church, probably.
Right. Well, and that's part of the problem with. I think that's maybe a showrunner / network problem, or streaming service problem, because one of the things, I interviewed an actress who is Christian, maybe grew up evangelical, is on not exactly evangelical ground anymore, but still a believer, I would say. And she said one of the things she runs into is that streaming services and TV studios are interested in the fruits of faith, like forgiveness and grace. Not theological grace, but graciousness.
I believe in belief.
And that sort of thing, family and courage and stuff like that. But they're not interested in the specifics of the faith because that would alienate audiences. So what the challenge for Christian writers is to figure out how to do that, but keeping it low key enough that you're not going to send people running away and switching off. And I'm not a television writer, so I couldn't. But I would imagine. I think what you're responding to, Glenn, is a real missed opportunity in Ted Lasso, because he's just a good guy, and people, there are good secular guys out there, but there are also a lot of good Christian people who are not seeking to offend and not seeking to bite their neighbors' heads off and not seeking to march with a bullhorn in front of a funeral saying God hates gay people or whatever. There are decent salt of the earth people there. That just doesn't get connected with, at least not in this media environment, doesn't tend to get connected with Christian.
You made a sort of a subtle reference there to Westboro Baptist Church, and
I did.
Subtle and Westboro, not two words you hear together very often.
There we go. We're Westboro Baptist Church. We split off with a subtle version of Westboro Baptist Church. So is it Megan Phelps Roper, who was a member of that family, is now podcast queen extraordinaire after her series on J.K. Rowling. Now, I'm really interested in the fact that her testimony of, escape from the Westboro Baptist Church community is actually about her seeing a kind of a humanity in, I forget which actress it was. There was an actress who died.
Brittany Murphy?
Brittany Murphy, that was it.
Yeah.
And she had seen a Brittany Murphy film, and please forgive me, I don't think I have ever seen a Brittany Murphy film, but she'd seen a Brittany Murphy film, and she felt really sad when she heard that Brittany Murphy had died. And it was pursuing that, and in conversation with people on Twitter, I think, that she started to have her sort of, classically the aspect ratio on her screen changed, and suddenly the world was a much larger, richer, and more complicated place. So I think she's a really interesting example of someone who, again, was persuaded into a new set of beliefs, or into a radically different set of beliefs through the power of media. She felt an emotional connection with Brittany Murphy, even though she'd only really ever seen her in films and playing a part. So just the persuasive power, which I think is part of the thing you're talking about with the Oasis of Imagination.
Yeah, and the thing about Oasis is it's where people can see each other as humans, and and get into art and culture and popular culture that explores shared desires, shared frustrations, shared plights that that should move us emotionally. I mean, I think what people respond to negatively against Christians is that they feel so dehumanized by certain Christians. You know, either reduced to "you're my project for evangelism," or "I'm just going to shout and scream at you because you people are going to hell," or, you know, Westboro Baptist Church types. And that's all they see of Christians. That's all they know of Christians, because they don't know a lot of Christians. My daughter runs into this a lot. She lives in California, and she's an artist, and people are surprised when they find out she's a Christian. And she says, "Really?" And I'm like, "Well, because you're not hateful or anything." And she said, "Well, how many Christians do you actually know personally?" And they're like, "Oh, you know." So that's powerful testimony of a life lived the way Jesus wants you to live it, loving people rather than trashing them. But it also means that there's an extra burden incumbent upon Christian creators to try to connect with other people as humans, rather than trying to make your creation into a bullhorn for your perspective, for your worldview.
Ted, is a lot of the battle actually just releasing Christians and telling them, you know what, you can actually be an artist, you can actually run along and be the musician that you've always wanted to be, you can actually be the dancer you've always wanted to be, you can actually be the fine artist you've always wanted to be. Run along. It's not sub-Christian. It's not, you're not, your salvation is not in doubt, because you're running out into the world with the gifts that God has given you, and let 1,000 flowers bloom. Is it like, why doesn't that work? Like, as just if we want to get Christian art out there, just tell Christians to get out there and do your art in the marketplace. And if it doesn't get supported by the market, maybe you don't have the gifts you thought you did anyway. So try your hand at something else. I don't know.
Okay. There's lots of things to say. First of all, this is something that, let me tell you a story. A couple of years ago, I did a Cambridge summer apologetics thing that was put on by the Round Church in Cambridge. And I got there, my wife and I got there, and we met this young American guy who's sort of arranging things. And he was like, you ready? And I'm like, and I was like, yeah, I think so. And he's like, are you nervous? And I was like, of course I'm nervous. I'm coming to the land of Stott. I'm coming to the land of Lloyd Jones. I'm coming to the land of Lewis. What could I possibly have to offer you guys? Like, I'm coming to the land of J.I. Packer, for crying out loud. What can I? And he was like, no, you're thinking about this all wrong. We really need what you have to say about culture and worldview. And then he told me a story. He said, I cannot tell you how many times I have sat with students in a cafe or something like that, and the conversation goes something like this. He'll lower his voice and he'll say, I really like medicine. And then he'll look around to make sure nobody's listening. He said, my mom and dad want me to go into the ministry. Can I serve the Lord as a doctor? I was like, no. And he's like, yeah. That's the attitude, is if you're going to serve the Lord, you become ordained, and everything else is sort of second class. So I would say, yes, a lot of it is challenging that, is saying there is a legitimate calling upon people who are creatively gifted. You would be wasted as a pastor. You ought to be a cinematographer. Obviously, You should be going painting. You should be writing scripts. You should be making music. Please, please don't go into the pastorate. I mean, churches may hate me for that, but I think there's something to that. So yes, there's something having to say, release them and get them trained up and get them honed in their craft and release them out into the marketplace. But the second thing is, and if you don't make it in the marketplace, maybe you don't have any talent. I think that's a really blunt instrument for something as fragile and as beautiful as an artist. I guess you didn't make it. Too bad. Out you go. This is where I would love to see churches treat artists as cultural missionaries. This is where I'd love to see large churches pony up and have an artist in residence. You know, some churches do that, but it's like the cool hipster, artsy churches that are usually in big urban centers or whatever. I'd like to see more churches bring that into discussion, because even the small churches support missionaries, right? Like that's a thing. There's no appetite, there's no awareness that artists are reaching a set of people that would never ever darken a church door. And that's something that
and is that set of people the other artists in that community, or is the set of people that are reaching the culture more generally?
And yes. Mm-hmm. Both and. Mm-hmm. There's the artists move. Artists have a sensibility and see things weird. They're just weird, right? They're weirdos, and they can connect with other people who see life not neurotypically as well. Like there's just something special about the way artists perceive things, that they can connect with other artists in a way that that I think it would be very difficult for your typical Christian who works in finance too, for example. But also, the works themselves, if they are done well, can have a reach far beyond the typical Christian, right? How many Tolkien fans are there out there? How many Tolkien fans are there out there? How many David Eugene Edwards fans are there out there? How many people have been touched by That Dragon Cancer? How many people have seen a Kieślowski film and kind of said, huh, right? And how much of that is possibly paving territory, or not paving, plowing up territory that could be fertile ground then for when they have a conversation with a Christian and it plants a seed.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying make art so that you can save people, because I think that's putting way too much of a burden on an artist, but make art that makes people more, that brings human beings into the space where it's even feasible to talk about.
Yeah. But all those examples are just great artists, aren't they? Like the reason why they've had the impact that they've had is because they are great at their craft.
Yes, but they're also bringing an ethos of hope in darkness that you don't typically find among a lot of artists. When you're talking about this great big gaping spiritual hole, that's where most of the creatives think that's the only way you can maintain intellectual integrity and aesthetic integrity, is if you constantly reference the way things are falling apart and decaying and are fragmented, and somehow you have a little bit of hope in there because, gosh, aren't we all messed up, and we can kind of take comfort in the fact that we're all messed up together. You know, the whole meta-modern thing. It's just, but at the end of the day, it's all about finding hope in a universe that gives no meaning, that gives no answer, right? That's everything everywhere all at once, right? It's, yeah, there's love. Nothing means anything, but we've got each other. And I think Christians can bring so much more to the table if they can do it in a way that's going to get past the BS meter of most non-Christians, right? And people have a hair trigger BS meter these days. There's so much of it flying around.
We're going to need another 2-hour conversation, but could you just give us like the shortest definition you can find on metamodern? Because I was just doing some stuff on this recently. I think it's probably the latest, like, genuinely new idea or term that I've come across in terms of people talking about culture and art and the imagination. So Ted, what is metamodernism?
Okay, I'm going to. I am just beginning to get into this myself, but as I understand metamodern, and let me reference. There is a great YouTube video called "Why." Yes, Thomas Flight. Why are movies different nowadays? And the way that here's how I come at it. I did my dissertation on Paul Ricoeur, and Paul Ricoeur
showing
coined.
off now, isn't he?
There's okay. Ricoeur coined a term. He called it the hermeneutics of trust versus the hermeneutics of suspicion. Okay, so hermeneutics, for your listeners out there who don't know what it is, it's a way of interpretation, a way of interpreting life, a way of interpreting anything. Hermeneutics of trust says, "Oh yeah, I'll take you at your word, and I'll trust what you have to say, whether that's the Bible or your landlord or whoever." It's just kind of having an openness to the truth. A hermeneutics of suspicion came about when Marx, Nietzsche, Freud, and all of those modern guys came on and says, no, things are not as they seem. There's an ulterior motive going on here, and that means you trust nothing. The Bible is just something to oppress people and to keep them enslaved, and we enlightened types know that it's not true. And his great hope, I guess, was for what he called a second naivete. That is, we've been through the Enlightenment. It's told us that we can't really trust anything, but maybe we can break through and grab a sort of ambiguous hope in the fact that maybe there's some meaning after all, but it's really hard to pin down. And I think metamodernism is doing the same thing. Except it's in reaction not to modernism, where we have like nation and rationality and science as all of these great themes that we can get behind as modern people. And then postmodern comes and says, no. These are all stupid and divisive and oppressive narratives that marginalize people, and it's you white guys, you white European guys who are just trying to take center stage, and let's just break everything down. And postmodernism broke everything down into cynicism and self-referential humor and all of that sort of stuff. And what metamodernism is doing is responding to that fragmentation and that cynicism, which goes nowhere ultimately, and says, okay, we know it's doing a Paul Ricoeur. It's doing the second naivete thing. We know that there's no real coherence in discourse. There's no real coherence in the universe. There's no real meaning there. But gosh darn it, doesn't it feel like there ought to be? And by embracing performativity, I know this is a performance, but isn't it genuine? You know, by embracing the artifice in a way that still tries to, like life as Wes Anderson film. That's the best I can put it. You know, where you still feel that your heart's getting tugged, even though you know it's a movie. And isn't that enough? So that's where I'm at right now. I need to do a whole lot more reading, because I want to start responding to that, because that's where I find my students right now. Is they're like, we can't believe any of this old stuff, Christianity stuff, and but there's still something there, right? Tell us there's something still there, but don't tell us in a way that's going to lay any claim on us ethically. We still want to do what we want to do, and we know it's all fake, but
Here, listen to Bittersweet Symphony by The Verve, and we'll finish on a song.
Yeah, exactly. Did you guys watch what's his name, Bo Burnham's Inside?
Yeah.
Right.
That is metamodern. Like, he especially the way he ends it. Like, we had in our COVID remote movie club, we talked about it, and like where he's talking about suicide, and where he's like getting out enraged when he's just ready to go back on the stage, and now he can't, and he's like going crazy, but not crazy enough to not forget to set up the camera to capture him going crazy. Right. It's all performance. It's really crafted, and it's crafted to seem spontaneous, and he means it.
He is a very complicated man, Bo Burnham.
He
incredibly gifted. Did you see Eighth Grade, his directorial debut as a movie?
I did not.
Okay.
I did not, because
probably the most depressing film I have ever seen in my entire life.
That's what I heard, and I was not ready for the most depressing film ever.
Yeah, it was
that and 13, or what was it? There was another teens coming of age and exploring things they probably shouldn't explore, and
it was
it
was difficult. But a genius, and someone who's making people think deeply about themselves and the world, and so on and so forth. So we need a Christian Bo Burnham.
Mm-hmm.
Yes,
that's what the Imagination Manifesto will produce. Is that right?
Before he got canceled, I was saying we need a Christian Joss Whedon, somebody who is absolutely allergic to cliche. Absolutely, is always looking for the kind of unexpected gut punch that kind of goes, "Ugh, wow, where'd that come from?" That's what I respond to as somebody who's older than a millennial, to Buffy, to Firefly,
post-millennial,
to sorry.
As a post-millennial.
It's an eschatology joke. Don't worry, Nate.
Yes.
Nate went to Westminster.
No. Got it. Post-mill. I mean, generation-wise, I'm pre-mill, but I'm not eschatology-wise pre-mill. So.
Okay. Yeah. So we need hope. A hopeful eschatology actually helps, but we need hope, and we need to tell stories of hope out there in the world. And I hope that your books absolutely inspire that in people. There is Imagination Manifesto that people can grab, or Oasis of Imagination. And Ted, it's been wonderful that you spared time for us. Just anywhere else that people can catch up with you online? I'm occasionally on Twitter. And I mentioned my website, tedturnau.com. Had to pay for that domain name, so make use of it, people. and I'll be at Keswick in week 3, and I much prefer to talk to people face to face about the Pittsburgh Steelers or Kieślowski or anything else. Yeah. And if anybody's passing through Prague, drop me a line. Sounds great. We'd love to do that. Definitely. Ted Turnau, thanks so much. Thank you. Take care, guys.